I never believed in ghosts. That's what everyone says, right? But after 20 years as a paranormal investigator, I thought I'd seen it all. The hoaxes, the misunderstandings, the easily explained phenomena. Then last year, 3 investigations changed everything I thought I knew about reality. For months, I've kept these experiences to myself, trying to rationalize what I witnessed. But I can't stay silent anymore. These stories need to be told. What happened at these 3 schools defies explanation, and I'm still haunted by the evidence we captured. Some say ignorance is bliss. After what I've seen, I'm inclined to agree. The Spanish Military Hospital School in Florida stands like a sentinel of the past, its weathered walls holding secrets darker than anyone could imagine. As I pulled up that cold February night, the moon cast long shadows across the building's facade, creating patterns that seemed to writhe and twist in the darkness. The history of the place is brutal. A military hospital during the Civil War, where hundreds of soldiers took their last breath. The halls that now echo with students' footsteps once rang with the screams of the dying. But it's what happens after dark that brought me here. Sarah, the night janitor, met me at the entrance. 20 years on the job, and I'd never seen someone look so haunted. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the heavy doors. Most of the activity happens in the old operating theater, she whispered, her voice cracking. That's where I saw things that made me question everything I believe in. She told me about the incidents, surgical instruments found rearranged in the morning, the sound of groaning coming from empty rooms, and most disturbing of all, the apparitions. They still think they're patients, Sarah said. Sometimes you'll see them wandering the halls in their hospital gowns, looking for doctors who've been dead for over a century. I set up my equipment methodically. EMF meters at strategic points, infrared cameras covering every angle, digital audio recorders in each room. Standard procedure. But nothing about that night would turn out to be standard. The first few hours were quiet, almost disappointing. Then, at 2:13 a.m., everything changed. It started with the sound of wheels squeaking down the hallway, that distinct sound of old hospital equipment rolling across worn floors. I followed it, camera in hand, expecting to find maybe a chair moved by a draft. Instead, I found an antique gurney, moving by itself, stopping right in front of the operating theater. The EMF meter in my hand went crazy, its reading off the charts. The temperature dropped so rapidly I could see my breath. And then, pause. I saw him. A young soldier, couldn't have been more than 20, lying on the gurney in a blood-soaked Civil War uniform. He was looking right at me, but his eyes were just empty black voids. Before I could move, the overhead lights started flickering wildly. Medical instruments began rattling in their cases, creating a cacophony of metal on metal. The soldier sat up, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I ran. In 20 years of investigations, I'd never run from anything. But this was different. What happened next defies explanation. Every camera, every piece of equipment we'd set up, captured something extraordinary. In the background of every shot, shadows moved across the walls. Not just 1 or 2, dozens of them. Like an entire ward of patients and doctors, still going about their eternal routines. The audio recordings were even worse. Beneath the static and equipment noise, voices. "Doctor, please, it hurts. We're losing him. More morphine, quickly." Conversations from a century ago, playing out over and over. But the most chilling evidence came from the thermal cameras in the operating theater. They showed clear heat signatures of multiple figures, standing in formation around an operating table. When we overlaid this footage with historical photos from the hospital's archives, the positions matched exactly with where the surgical team would have stood. The next morning, as I was packing up my equipment, Sarah found me. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely audible. "Something I've never told anyone." She pulled out an old photograph from 1864, showing the hospital's medical staff. There, in the back row, stood a figure that made my blood run cold. The same soldier I'd seen on the gurney, in full uniform, alive and well. The caption gave his name, Private Thomas Whitmore, died of his wounds, February 13th, 18... I checked the timestamp on our footage. The gurney incident? February 13th, 2:13 a.m., exactly 160 years later. After the hospital, I thought I needed a break, something simpler. When I heard about Indiana University's Reed Hall and its girl in pink, it seemed almost quaint. A classic college ghost story. In 1952, a young woman named Elizabeth Morgan attended a formal dance here, only to never leave the building again. I'd investigated dozens of similar cases. Usually they turned out to be urban legends, embellished over decades of retelling. But Red Hall was different. The evidence was overwhelming, and what we discovered went far beyond a simple haunting. The residence director, Dr. James Chen, had documented over 50 separate sightings since 1990. She only appears in mirrors, he explained, showing me his meticulously kept records, usually during formal events. But here's the thing. Every single witness describes her exactly the same way, down to the smallest detail. The shade of her dress, the pearl necklace, even the way her hair is styled. I decided to stage an event to draw her out. We recreated a 1950s formal dance, complete with period-accurate music and decorations. 20 students volunteered to participate, all equipped with cameras and EMF meters. The first 3 hours passed without incident. The volunteers were getting tired, the excitement wearing off. Then, at exactly midnight, everything changed. A freshman named Rachel screamed. In the grand entrance mirror, there she was, Elizabeth Morgan, in her flowing pink dress, dancing alone in a perfect reflection of the ballroom. But where our modern decorations stood in the real room, the mirror showed the original 1952 decorations. The temperature plummeted. The mirror's surface began to frost over, creating intricate patterns that spelled out words. May I have this dance? What happened next still gives me nightmares. I approached the mirror, camera rolling, determined to document everything. Elizabeth stopped dancing and turned toward me, her face, voice shaking. Where her face should have been, there was nothing. Just a swirling void of darkness, like looking into an infinite abyss. Suddenly, every mirror in the hall, all 17 of them, cracked simultaneously. In each fragment she appeared, multiplied dozens of times. But now she was moving toward us, her hands pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. The student volunteers panicked, running for the exits. But Rachel stood transfixed, staring into the main mirror. Before anyone could stop her, she reached out and touched the glass. The footage from our cameras shows what happened next in horrifying detail. Rachel's hand passed through the mirror's surface like it was water. Elizabeth grabbed her arm, trying to pull her through. It took 3 of us to pull Rachel back, and when we did, her arm was ice cold and covered in what looked like frost burns. But the real revelation came later, when we reviewed the historical records more thoroughly. Elizabeth Morgan hadn't just disappeared after the dance. She'd been found 3 days later, in a maintenance tunnel beneath the hall. The official ruling was suicide, but her diary, discovered in the university archives, told a different story. She'd been experimenting with mirrors, convinced they were portals to another dimension. Her final entry read, "The reflections are wrong. They show things that aren't there. Or maybe they show what's really there, and we're the reflections. Tonight, at the dance, I'll know for sure." The most disturbing part, the photograph in her student file. Elizabeth Morgan looked exactly like Rachel, our freshman volunteer, down to the smallest detail. Rachel transferred to another school the next day. But before she left, she confided something to me. Since that night, her reflection doesn't always match her movements. Sometimes it dances on its own. They say some places are naturally wrong, where the boundary between our world and something else wears thin. Room 428 in Ohio. University's Wilson Hall is one of those places. Sealed for decades, no one had been inside since 1978, when 5 students experienced something so horrifying that 2 of them... The university initially refused my request to investigate. But after months of negotiation and signing more liability waivers than I care to count, they finally agreed to let me enter the room. What I found there haunts me more than anything else in my career. The moment we broke the seals on the door, a wave of stale air hit us like a physical force. The room was exactly as it had been left in 1978. Books still open on the desk, bed still made, a half-written letter still sitting there, the pen lying beside it as if the writer had just stepped away for a moment. The writing started almost immediately. Words appearing on walls, then disappearing like invisible hands were scratching them into the plaster. But these weren't random words or phrases. They were names, dates, personal details about everyone in the room. Things no one could have known. My cameraman, Mike, nearly quit on the spot when the words revealed the name of his childhood imaginary friend. The university administrator accompanying us went pale when the wall displayed the exact time and location of his father's death, information he'd never told anyone. Objects began moving, not violently flying across the room like in movies, but slowly dragging themselves across surfaces, as if being pulled by invisible strings. The temperature kept dropping until we could see our breath, forming strange patterns in the air that seemed almost like faces. Then we found the diary. Hidden inside a wall cavity, its pages yellow with age, it explained everything. In 1978, a student named Marcus Chen had become obsessed with theoretical physics, specifically the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. He believed he'd found a way to pierce the veil between parallel universes. The diary detailed his experiments, rituals combining quantum theory with elements of various esoteric traditions. But what he and his friends called through wasn't from another universe. It was from somewhere much worse. The last entry reads, "They're here. They've always been here. We just taught them how to reach through. God forgive us. We showed them how to open the door." As I read those words aloud, every light in the building went out simultaneously. In the darkness, we heard scratching. Not from the walls this time, but from the air itself, as if something was clawing its way through invisible barriers. When the emergency lights finally kicked on, there was a message carved into the ceiling, the gouges still smoking slightly. "Thank you for letting us out." The next 24 hours are still mostly a blur. University police evacuated the building after multiple students reported seeing shadowy figures in every reflective surface. The administration ordered room 428 resealed, this time with concrete and steel. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The message I found carved inside the diary's back cover, dated the day before our investigation. Time isn't linear here anymore. What you're about to do has already happened, will always happen. The door never closes again. 2 weeks later, I received an email from a quantum physics lab in California. They'd recorded unprecedented readings the night of our investigation, spikes in radiation and magnetic fields that defied explanation. The head researcher included a note. "Whatever you did, please don't do it again. You created ripples we're still trying to understand." The room was sealed again, but sometimes, late at night, students report seeing lights in room 428. Security guards speak of hearing scratching sounds that seem to follow them down empty hallways. And across campus, people have begun noticing that their reflections sometimes move. These 3 investigations changed me fundamentally. I still do this work. I have to now. Because once you've seen behind the curtain of reality, you realize that someone needs to document what's out there. Someone needs to warn others. But I'll tell you this. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. And some stories are better left untold. Because in the telling, we make them real again. Sleep well if you can. And whatever you do, Don't look too long in mirrors tonight.